This is lecture number 4, and we're looking at the exegesis. We're actually going to be in the text now, more so in the past than in the past. And we're going to be looking at chapter 1:1 through 5:27. This will get us in through the prologue, and then into Job's first speech, and then another speech. So the prologue, as we mentioned, is chapter 1:1 through 2:13 of the book of Job. And there are two fundamental truths from this prologue. One is that Job is righteous and that Job is suffering undeservedly, not suffering because of some great sin. And that goes against the idea of retributive justice, that if you obey God, then you're blessed in this life. If you disobey God, then you're suffer in this life. And sometimes that's true, and that's what we see as general truth in Proverbs, but it's not true in Job's life, and Job knows it. Now the friends say, well, it's because you've sinned and you're just not confessing it. Again, the pattern of the prologue is with these alternating scenes on earth and then in heaven. And in Job 1:1 through 5 is the first earthly scene. The book opens in the land of Uz. And we talked about the background of Uz in the last video, so you can go back there and look at that. But then it alternates to the heavenly in verses 6 through 12, and then back to the earthly in verses 13 through 22, and then in chapter 2 to the heavenly in verses 1 through 6, and then back to the land of Uz, the earthly. So we have earthly, heavenly, and then earthly. And then you get into the dialogue of the book, which is set on earth. Klein's comments, the scenes are, with one exception, kept clearly distinct from one another by the phrase, and there was a day when, at the beginning of the second, third, and fourth scenes. And the exception to this draws attention to itself. Not only is the introductory phrase not found in 2:7, but for the only time in the prologue, one of the actors, and the actor here is Satan or Satan, moves out of his proper sphere from the heavenly into the earthly. In 2:7 it says that as he goes out from the presence of God, that he struck Job. The first scene is in the land of Uz, and this is chapter 1:1 through 5, and it's in the earthly. And the beginning of the book is most narrative books in the Hebrew Bible begin with, in the Hebrew, Vayehi, and it's translated usually something like it came about, and it came about. Joshua 1:1 is an illustration of that, of a narrative, and that signifies there's a connection with the preceding narrative, and it came about. Well, the book of Job doesn't begin that way. The book of Job begins, a man there was. That's a literal Hebrew. It began, the very first word in the book of Job is the word man. And this man, of course, is Job. Klein's notes that this doesn't imply that this book is a fairy tale, but that it has no link with any stage in the course of Israel's history. Now, in chapter 1:1, Job is described. So there was a man on earth in the land of Uz, and then that man is described, and by two pairs of descriptive words, blameless and upright, and fearing God and turning away from evil. And these words and these phrases are found throughout the wisdom literature of the Hebrew Bible. The first phrase there, blameless and upright. In Proverbs 2, verse 21, for the upright will live in the land, and the blameless will remain in it. And that's Hebrew parallelism. And in chapter 28 and verse 10, he who leads the upright astray in an evil way will himself fall into his own pit, but the blameless will inherit good. So you have upright and blameless in parallel there. And Psalm 37:37, mark the blameless man, and behold the upright, for the man of peace will have a posterity. So you have blameless, upright, and then man of peace, and all of those are parallel to each other. We mentioned in the last video, it says that Job was blameless, and the King James translates this as perfect. To a Hebrew mind, only God is perfect. The idea behind this Hebrew term is not sinless. The Hebrew term is tam, and it means without moral blemish, or blameless or innocent, and blameless is a good translation of this. So Job was blameless. And the next phrase is that he is fearing God and he turns away from evil. In Proverbs 3 and verse 7, as these phrases are also found in the wisdom literature, do not be wise in your own eyes, fear the Lord, and turn away from evil. So it's not just the positive of fearing the Lord, but it's also the negative of turning away from evil. Proverbs 16:17, the highway of the upright is to depart from evil. He who watches his way preserves his life. It doesn't talk about fearing the Lord in that verse, but the upright is the one who does fear the Lord. As we mentioned in verse 2, Job's family is mentioned apart from his wife. And in verse 2, there was born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. And it may be the idea, the implication, that he has 7 sons and 3 daughters because of how he's described in verse 1, how that he is perfect, or that he's blameless and upright, and he fears God and shuns evil. These numbers point to perfection. I'm not saying that they're not literal, they didn't have 7 sons and 3 daughters, but it points to perfection, and also the description of his possessions, of his livestock. We have 7,000, 3,000, and so on. Now we come back in verse 4 to his family, and his sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day. And then they would send and they would invite the 3 sisters to eat and to drink with them. And the picture here might be just an endless round of parties with a feast for each day of the week. That could be what on his day means. Others suggest on his day refers to the birthdays of each. And so they're having these celebrations, these parties. Job offered burnt offerings for his children, and he said that they may have sinned and they may have blasphemed God in their hearts. And we mentioned this in the last video, but the word translated blasphemed or cursed by the King James is interesting because the Hebrew actually has to bless, the Hebrew term barak. And it's used here as a euphemism for its opposite of to curse and to blaspheme. Some suggest the rabbis suggest that not to have God in such close connection with the verb for curse, but I don't know if I buy that because you find it elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. But notice that Job is acting as patriarch, and he's offering these burnt offerings, these ascending offerings for his children. So that's the first scene, verses 1 through 5, that sets up where you have this man who is blameless, without moral defect, and it talks about his possessions and talks about his family, and how that Job is also offering sacrifices for his family, for his children. The second scene, so that's on 1 through 5 is on earth. The second scene is in heaven. It's verses 6 through 12. It came about on a day, and it moves from the timelessness of the first scene. It doesn't say on a day, but to a particular time. There was a day. So the first scene, Job's blameless and so on, and now there was a day, and on this day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came among them. And sons of God, I think, is best interpreted as angels. And God points out to Satan, and he calls out Job, points out Job. It's interesting. God is the one, not Satan, who calls attention to the exemplary life of Job. First, he asks Satan, he says, where are you coming? And Satan answered, from going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? Have you considered? The Hebrew here is, have you set your heart on Job? And when we talk about, or when we have in the text here, Satan or Satan, throughout the book of Job, it always has the definite article. Satan means the accuser. And so this is the accuser, or the Satan. Later it comes in the Bible to refer to a proper name of Satan, but here it is the accuser, which I think is Satan and is the devil, but throughout the book it is the accuser, Ha-Satan. Satan responds then to God, and notice Satan doesn't question what God has said about Job. I mean, in verse 8, God echoes what the narrator tells us, and he adds a little bit to it. I mean, he says, there's no one like him on the earth. He is, he's blameless, he's wholehearted, he's an upright man, he fears God, and he shuns evil. So God says there's no one like him on the earth. And Satan doesn't question that, but he questions Job's motivation. Does Job's piety come from his prosperity? And Satan responds by arguing, well, does he fear God for nothing? Or have you have made a hedge around him and around his house, that's his possessions, and all that he has on every side. God's blessed Job, so Satan says, of course Job is faithful to God. And Satan suggests, you put forth your hand now and touch, strike all that he has, and he will blaspheme you to your face. And in verse 11, when it says blaspheme you or curse you, that's again the Hebrew word it's translated curse or blaspheme because that's the meaning, but it is the Hebrew word for bless. And we're going to see later on here in this lecture that there's a little bit of, subtlety in that. So Satan says, when you strike him, he will curse you. But in the Hebrew it says, when you strike him, he will bless you. It doesn't mean bless, but he means curse. But Job responds when he is struck with not cursing, but blessing. So that's the second scene. Here's the third scene in verses 13 through 22. So we've been in the earthly and then the heavenly, and now we go back to the earthly. And this is in the land of Uz, and 4 disasters come upon Job. It happened on a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And then it's like bam, 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 was one right after the other. These disasters come. So there came a messenger and said, the oxen were plowing, donkeys feeding beside them, and Sabaeans made a raid. And then they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only have escaped. While he's saying that, there came another messenger and said, a fire of God is fallen from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And then while he's speaking, there came another messenger to Job and said, the Chaldeans came in 3 bands, and they came upon they fell upon the camels, and they took them away, and then they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only have escaped. While he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and behold, there came a great wind from across the desert, and it struck the 4 corners of the house and fell upon the young people, and they are dead. And I alone am escaped to tell you. Notice these disasters alternate between human and supernatural calamities. So you have the Sabaeans and the Chaldeans as humans, and then you have lightning, and it's described as fire of God. And then in verse 19 you have a whirlwind, a great wind. So there's alternating between human and supernatural calamities. Also, these disasters strike from all points of the compass, the south, the east, the north, and the west. And then you have these disasters as they're likely increasing in intensity. It talks in each one the livestock, and then the servants, and then finally in the last one, Job's children are killed. And also it tells us in this account that all of Job's possessions were wiped out in this one day. And back in chapter 1 and verse 2, verses 2 and 3, we're given an account of his possessions. But if you go through this here, all of his possessions are wiped out in one day. And in verse 19, the last disaster that comes from this wind, this great wind from across the desert or the wilderness. It's sometimes called a Sirocco wind or Khamsin wind. Jeremiah 4:11 mentions a scorching wind. This wind stands out here in that it struck the four corners of the house. Probably not like not a tornado, but something like that, in that this wind struck all four corners of the house at the same time. Now, what is Job's response? And in this book, it's building it up in the drama. What's going to be Job's response to this? He is presented as a blameless man who fears God, turns away from evil. What's his response? And we've seen that Satan has appeared, and he said, you strike him and he will curse you. Well, in verses 20 and 21 at the end of chapter 1, here's Job's response. Then, in light of what's just happened, then Job arose and tore his robe, shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. Job blessed God. Remember earlier we said that Satan said that Job would bless God with the Hebrew word barak, but Satan meant that Job would curse God. He's using bless as a euphemism. Well, Job does bless God, the Hebrew word barak, in 121. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And here it's not Job, as Kleins points out, Job himself does not simply bless God. He does bless God, but he expresses a wish that wherever the news of his suffering spreads, people may bless God. They may display their reverence for God. So that's the third scene. The fourth scene, as we move back to heaven in verses 1 through 6 of chapter 2, is heavenly. And now it begins again, there was a day when. And it's again drama as it's heightening the effect. And it repeats the words from verses 6 through 8 of chapter 1. So again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. Satan also was among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, From where are you coming? And Satan answered, From going to and fro in the earth, from walking up and down in it. And the Lord said unto Satan, Have you considered my servant Job? There is none like him in the earth. He is blameless, an upright man, one that fears God and shuns evil. And so it's repeating all of that from that previous heavenly account. And then in verse 3 it says, And he still holds fast his integrity. And though you move me against him to destroy him without cause. So Job still holds fast to his integrity. Now, what this may say in the book, is it's setting this up, is that first trial was not severe enough. Satan said about Job that he doesn't fear you for nothing. He says to God, he doesn't fear you for nothing. You strike him and he'll curse you. Well, he is stricken and yet he doesn't curse God. He blesses God, but the idea may be that first trial was not severe enough. So there's going to be another trial. And in the fifth scene, in verses 7 through 13, we read about that. But backing up a little, he says in that fourth scene, Satan says, skin for skin. All that a man has, he'll give for his life. And I don't know exactly what that phrase, skin for skin, means, but it has to do with the idea you get down to to his physical life, and he'll give up all these possessions. He will curse you. You put forth your hand now, touch his bone and flesh, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord says to Satan, behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life. And so we come then to the fifth scene, which is earthly. And so Satan goes forth from the presence of the Lord, and he strikes Job with this skin disease, this second affliction. Just as Job lost all his possessions, he is now struck with this disease that afflicts his whole body. It says, from the sole of his foot even to the crown of his head in verse 7. And the word here in Hebrew for his disease is a general term. It can cover various skin diseases. It probably has something to do with boils. In verse 7, the NIV translates this as painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. And in verse, let me see if I can get to the New American Standard, it translates it as sore boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And throughout the book, there are perhaps symptoms, and remember this is a book of poetry, so we got to be careful we don't take this as literal in some of these places, but it appears that symptoms of his disease, he has itching, emaciation in 1920, fever in 30:30, nightmares in 7:14, he can't sleep in 7:4, and weeping. So it's a serious physical affliction. And Job, in verse 8, took a potsherd to scrape himself. That's a piece of broken pottery, because he is he's out on the in the garbage dump. And he's scraping himself. He's sat among the ashes, and then his wife appears. Now we've been told about his children, and now in verse 9, his wife says to him, so God says, you consider my servant Job? There's no one like him. He still holds fast, and yet Satan, you've provoked me to destroy him, to swallow him up, and you only spare his life. And he's been stricken, and his wife shows up, and she tells Job, are you still holding fast your integrity? That's what God said he was doing, holding fast his integrity. Still holding fast to that. Curse God and die. And the word for curse here, again, as we've been seeing, is the Hebrew word that means to bless. It's used as a word here for curse. Curse God and die. Is it accidental that these words are what Satan said that Job would do? But Job didn't do that. He blesses God. Now, in the mouth of Job's wife, she says, curse God and die. And this would be a further temptation to Job. And Job replies to her. And he says, you are speaking as one of the foolish women, the impious women. The Hebrew word there, naval, doesn't mean weak intellectually, but somebody who is weak morally and spiritually. You are, and he doesn't call her foolish. He says, you are speaking as if you were. Maybe Job at this point recognizes the stress she's under, since he's undergoing these afflictions. And he answers her, what, shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept evil or adversity? Job views this as coming from God. And we're told by the narrator, in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. And I think what we're to understand is yet. I mean, Job is not sinless, but at this point he says Job did not sin with his lips. And then at the end of chapter 2, we have the arrival of Job's friends. When they heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came, everyone from his own place. And the idea is they're scattered in different places. Their names are given: Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, and they had to, there's some time involved in this because they made an appointment together, so they had to meet together to come to Job to comfort him. And this is a bridge between the prologue proper and then the dialogue of the speeches in the book. And this probably didn't happen overnight. There's probably some weeks or some months between his calamities and the arrival of his friends. And then these friends, the three friends here, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, have names that are connected with Edom. Edom is a descendant of Esau, and there are other texts that tell us that Edom, the land of Edom, was known for its wisdom. In Jeremiah 49 and verse 7, concerning Edom, thus says the Lord of hosts, is there no longer any wisdom in Teman? Teman is a place in Edom. Is there no longer any wisdom in Teman? Has good counsel been lost to the prudent? Has their wisdom decayed? It appears they were known for wisdom. And also in Obadiah verse 8, will I not on that day, declares the Lord, destroy wise men from Edom and understanding from the mountain of Esau? Well, the friends show up, and in verse 12, they see Job, but they're amazed how Job doesn't look like the Job that they know. And they lifted up their voice and wept and tore their garment, their outer garment, and threw dust on their heads toward heaven. They see Job, but he doesn't look like the Job that they know. It doesn't look like Job to them. And it's a little bit difficult here, I think, because when it says, when they lifted up their eyes from far off, and they don't know him. Well, you don't expect to know him when you see him far off. Maybe they just saw the silhouette, but as they get closer, they don't recognize him. But the idea may be they lifted up their eyes far off. They saw Job, but the idea of they did not know him means they didn't acknowledge him. And acknowledge him as the Job that they know, the living Job. They don't greet him because Job is dead to them. They treat him as somebody already dead. And some suggest, the things that they do, they lift up their voice and they weep, they tear their outer garments, they throw dust. Those are mourning rituals. And some have suggested in verse 13, so they sat down with him upon the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his grief was very great. It's the idea, perhaps, that they're going through this mourning ritual. One commentator notes that these rites, they're afraid that this could happen to them as well. But the idea, I think, is that they're already mourning Job is dead. Now, how would you like to be there as Job and your friends show up and they recognize you as already dead? So, a little bit of review here. The prologue is 1:1 through 2:13. We just finished that. Narrator is the one who tells us about that. Then we come to the dialogue in chapter 3 and verse 1, and that runs for a long section into 42:6. And then at the end of the book is the epilogue, 42:7 through 17, and that's the narrator as well. So the dialogue is made up of 3 cycles of Job and his 3 friends. And in chapter 3, 1 through 26 is Job first speaking. And then Eliphaz in his first cycle, 4:1 through 5:27. And then Job again, 6:1 through 7:21. And Bildad in 8:1 through 22. and then Job again in 9:1 through 10:22, and then Zophar in 11:1 through 20. That's the first cycle. And we narrow this down now. Job chapter 3, verses 1 through 26 is the first cycle of the dialogue, and that's Job speaking, and this is a lament. And the structure of this is in verses 1 and 2, we have a headline to this, and then an introduction of the speaker. It's going to be Job. Verses 3 through 10, Job laments on the days of his conception and birth, and there's a theme here of day and night in verse 3. And then verses 4 through 9 takes up the day and night again. Verses 4 and 5 about day, and then verses 6 through 9 about night. Then verses 11 through 19 is the question, why? You see that in verse 11 of chapter 3. Why did I not die from the womb? Why did I not perish at birth? And so he wishes that he died at birth. And then verses 20 through 26 is the why question again. You look at verse 20, why, and it's the same Hebrew term, however it may be translated, but why, and it's a wish that he could die now. Obviously he didn't die at birth because he's speaking, but now there is a why, couldn't he just die right now? And we continue this structure. So that's verses 20 through 26 through the rest of this lament. Now in verse 4, let's begin at the beginning of the chapter 3:1. After this, Job opened his mouth. And in Scripture, opening the mouth, I mean, if you're going to say something, of course you're going to open your mouth. So it may be that here it's emphasizing what is said. Like in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus went up to a high mountain, opened his mouth, and then he spoke. Job opens his mouth and cursed, and all the build-up in the prologue we expect, and Job cursed God. That's not what he says. Job cursed his day. And it's the day of his day of his conception and the day of his birth. And Job spoke and said, and then in verse 3, let this day perish where I was born. In the night when it said, a man-child is brought forth. And in verse 4, it's a parody, it appears, of the creation account. Let that day be darkness. It's like a reversal of God's word at creation. In creation, of course, in Genesis 1:3, God said, let there be light. Here in Job chapter 3, verse 4, Job says, let there be darkness. Let that, and the Hebrew phrase is exactly the same as Genesis 1:3. Let that day, let it be darkness. And let this darkness, this shadow of death, claim it for their own. In verse 5. And in the New American Standard in verse 5, that's translated black gloom. That phrase, I guess literally shadow of death. In verse 5, the NIV has utter darkness. It's the same phrase that's found in the famous Psalm 23. And probably it means something like, not a compound word, shadow of darkness, but an idea of meaning deep darkness. Let that day be deep darkness. And let God not seek after it from above, and don't let the light shine on it. Let darkness and this extreme darkness claim it for its own. There will be a cloud on that day. And as for the night, let that night be thick darkness. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not even be in the number of the months. Let it be desolate, and let no joyful voice come from it. And then verse 8 he says, let them curse it that curse the day, who are ready to wake up Leviathan, rouse Leviathan. Leviathan, later in the book, probably refers to a crocodile or something, but here, Leviathan often refers in the Hebrew Scripture to a violent sea monster from mythology. In Psalm 74:14, you crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. Isaiah 27 and verse 1, in that day the Lord will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, with his fierce and great and mighty sword, even Leviathan, the twisted serpent, and he will kill the dragon who lives in the sea. So it's referring to some sort of myth. And again, I'm not saying that Job actually believed this, but he's using poetic language here of Leviathan. And he says, let those curse it that curse the day. And he may be talking about sorcerers you could hire somebody to curse a day, and also they could wake up Leviathan. Certain days had mythological background of viewed as being unlucky, like in some cultures today, like the 13th day is unlucky, and the 13th floor, or something like that. So Job says, let that day be cursed by these people. And in verse 9, he says, let the stars of the twilight be dark. They'll look for light, but they'll have none. It's like they have eyelids and they open their eyes of the morning, but let it be darkness. These stars of the twilight are the morning stars, probably Venus and Mercury to us. And I don't know a lot about astronomy, but the stars that first come out and or the last ones come out to show that there is this coming day. Now, if they're darkened, then the day can't come. And so there's endless night. So let there be endless night. Let it shut up the doors of my mother's womb, in verse 10. And I wouldn't have been born, he says. Verse 11, why didn't I die from my mother's womb? And I would have been quiet, I would have slept, I would have been at rest. And in verses 14 and 15, he talks about being at rest in Sheol. Sheol is the place of the dead. And he says, I would have slept, I would have been at rest with kings and counselors of the earth, and princes that had gold and filled their houses with silver. It's kind of interesting. Why would he even bring up kings and counselors here? Klein's comments, why should Job, who's one of the privileged members of society, he was when he had all the possessions, look upon life as essentially social turmoil and upon death as a desirable state, to abolish these social distinctions? While he was the greatest of the sons of the East, he looked at life that way, that he had some privilege. Now he's become deprived. He's lost everything. He's socially outcast. It appears the friends are treating him as if he's already dead. And so social oppression that ends in death is a good thing. I would rest in Sheol, he says. In verses 1 through 26, as we're still in this cursing, he says, I would have died at birth, and the wicked would cease from troubling the small and the great. And by the way, let me say this: as we're studying through this, it's understood that you'll have a Bible open to read these sections and to follow along. So he says, the light that's given here is, I want it to be darkness. The last verse of chapter 3, I was not at ease, neither was I quiet, neither had I rest. Trouble came. All right, so in this slide here, it's the overview again. So we looked at 3:1 through 26 in the dialogue section. And so the next person that speaks is Eliphaz. in chapter 4:1 through 5:27, and that's what we will look at in this section in this lecture. So then answered Eliphaz the Temanite, and this is his first speech. And then he said, and he says, if somebody wants to say a word to you, will you be weary? Who can withhold from speaking? You've instructed many, he says in verse 3. Now what Eliphaz is going to present is basically the conventional theology of his time. And it's the idea that that you obey God, Job, then things go well in this life. You don't obey God, then it doesn't go well. And again, that's taught in Proverbs, but it's not an ironclad promise. And yet he's expounding that in this speech. In his first speech here, he says, you have instructed many. The verb here is you've admonished many. You've disciplined many. You've admonished many is how the New American Standard translates that. And you've upheld those who are falling. You strengthened the feeble. But now it's come to you, and you're weary. It touches you, and you're frightened. Verse 6 is not the fear of God, your confidence, and the hope that you have, the integrity of your ways. And he's responding to what Job has just said when he cursed the day of his conception and birth. And then he says, I have been born. Why doesn't God just kill me right now? But he says, it's come to you and you don't want to listen. Verse 7, remember, whoever perished being innocent. And when was the upright cut off? There are those that plow iniquity and sow mischief, and they'll reap the same. And again, that's generally true. That's sort of like what Paul says, that whatever a person sows, they'll also reap. And then Eliphaz says, by the breath of God they perished, and the blast of his anger. The lion roars, the fierce lion howls. You go back to verse 7, remember, whoever perished being innocent, or when were the upright cut off? And what's just happened? Well, Job's friends have perished. They've died. Does he not remember that? Does he not know that? But the lion is roaring, and there's all kind of terms here for lions. The fierce lion, the young lions, the old lions, the whelps of the lioness. And now a word, he says, I want to tell you, a word was secretly brought to me. Here's the structure of Eliphaz's speech. In 4:1 is the introduction. And then 2 through 11, he addresses Job. He says, you're not to, in light of your personal situation, verses 2 through 6, you're not very open to listening to anyone. In verses 7 through 11, he says, there is a contrast between the fate of the righteous and the wicked. And now in verses 12 through 21, he says, I want to tell you about a word that was secretly brought to me. My ear received a whisper. And he's going to describe a vision in the night that he saw. In 12 through 16, he tells the circumstances of that. A word was secretly brought to me. My ear received a whisper, and in thoughts from the visions of the night, when humans should be in deep sleep, fear came on me and trembling, and it was so terrifying that my bones were shaking. A spirit passed before me. My thoughts were disquieting, excited thoughts, and a spirit passed before me, and it made the hair of my flesh to stand up. And he says, it stood still. But I couldn't discern the appearance of it. A form was before my eyes, and I heard a still voice. That's the circumstances. Let me tell you about it's coming from outside of me, he says. So you better listen to this. And then he says in 17 through 21, the content of this voice. What does this voice say? Then he talks about the implications of this voice. shall mortal humans be just before God? And the word that he uses here in verse 17 is not the word that's generally used for humans. It's not Adam. It's the Hebrew word anosh. And this again is poetry, and so we need to be careful we don't make too much about this. But anosh is sometimes emphasizing the lowliness of humans. So shall mortal man be just before God? Shall a man be pure before his Maker? Behold, he puts no trust in his servants, and his angels he charges with folly. And how much more those that dwell in houses of clay? That's the mortal humans. That's mortal man, whose foundation is in the dust. Human's frail body is built on the foundation of dust, who are crushed before the moth, in verse 19. Between morning and evening they're shattered, they perish forever without any regarding it. In verse 21 it's like humans are like a tent, and the tent cords are plucked up, and they die, and without kakam, without wisdom. They died without discovering this wisdom. And so you need to understand this wisdom, Job. Then in chapter 5, as this structure continues, verses 1 through 7, Eliphaz in this discourse talks about the fate of the fool, those who die without wisdom. Call now. Is there any that will answer you? And to which of the holy ones will you turn? And the holy ones may refer to angels. For anger kills the foolish man, and envy slays the silly one. I've seen the foolish taking root, but suddenly I looked at the habitation as cursed. His children are far from safety. They're crushed in the gate, with none to deliver them. Whose harvest the hungry eats up, and takes it even out of the thorns and the snare for their substance. And then verse 6, for affliction comes not forth from the dust, neither doth trouble spring out of the ground. But verse 7, man, and this is not Anosh, it's Adam, is born for trouble as the sparks fly upward. And this is a little bit difficult. It appears that humans bring, because of human life, there is trouble as naturally as the sparks fly upward, as naturally as sparks fly upward. Literally, this says, and the sons of flame. And it may be figurative language of saying the sparks that come from a fire will fly upward. There have been some that have understood this as demons, in contrast to the holy ones of chapter 5, verse 1. But it's translated in 5:1 on the New American, or 5:7 in the New American Standard as sparks fly upward, as we've been seeing here, and also in the NIV as surely as sparks fly upward. And that's probably the idea, is as sparks from a fire fly upward, then humans are born for trouble. That's the fate of the fool. Now verses 8 through 16, he contrasts God's dealings with the righteous and the wicked. As for me, Job, I would seek for God, and to God I would commit my cause. As for me, if these afflictions had come upon me, I would seek the Holy One in prayer and in supplication. Not what you've just done in chapter 3 of cursing the day of your conception and birth. I'd commit to God my cause if it were me. As for me, and the as for me is emphatic here. And God is the one who does great things. They're unsearchable, marvelous things without number. And he gives some illustrations. He gives rain on the earth. He sends waters on the fields. He sets up on high those that are low. Those that mourn are exalted to safety. He frustrates the device of the crafty. And probably in this context, the crafty are those who would take away from the lowly, so that their hands can perform nothing substantial. So he's contrasting God's dealings with the righteous and with the wicked. He takes the wise in their own craftiness. They meet with darkness in the daytime. They grope at noonday as in the night. And maybe playing on the idea of darkness that Job has brought up. And he saves from the sword of their mouth, even the needy from the hand of the mighty. So the poor have hope, and iniquity stops her mouth. So God's dealings with the righteous and wicked are contrasted. Now in verses 17 through 26 is a discourse on the fate of the righteous. He's talked about the fate of the fool in chapter 5, 1 through 7. Then he talks about the contrasting dealings with the righteous and wicked. Now 17 through 26 is the fate of the righteous. And he begins with Enoch. Behold, look at this. Blessed is the man whom God corrects. Therefore, do not despise the chastening of the Almighty. So what he's hinting at here is that Job, you're being disciplined, you're being chastened. God wounds, and his hands make whole. He'll deliver you, and he gives in 6 troubles, in 7. He really means there are 7, and this is a thing that's used in poetic literature. There shall be no evil that will touch the righteous. And he holds out hope that Job is among the group of the righteous. And in famine he'll redeem you from death, in war from the power of the sword. You'll be hidden from the scourge of the tongue. You'll not be afraid of destruction when it comes. At destruction and famine you'll laugh. That's not what you're doing now, Job. You're not laughing. And you'll not be afraid of the beasts of the earth. They will be it's the word in verse 23, the word for covenant, berit, with the stones of the field, and the beast of the field shall be at peace with you. It's poetic language here. The stones won't accumulate to ruin your fields for crops, and wild beasts won't attack your livestock or destroy your crops, because it's as though a covenant were made with these stones. They shouldn't cause damage. And there's peace with the beast, in league with them. And you'll know that your tent is in peace. Even though you're lowly, all of us are lowly, and we're created beings and we're humans, but your tent will be in peace, and you'll not miss anything. And you'll know also that your seed shall be great. It seems like Eliphaz, in the fervor of his pleading here, has forgotten that Job's children have died. Your seed shall be great. Your descendants shall be great. Well, Job doesn't have any descendants at this point, and your offspring as the grass of the earth. You'll come to your grave in ripe age, in firm strength is the idea, and even with the idea of your faculties will not be impaired. You'll die in full number of your days in old age. He's not really holding out any hope beyond the grave, but he's saying you'll have a long life and death without the failure of the powers that usually come with old age. And we're told at the end of the book, Job does live a long life after this. And he says, it will be in verse 26, like a shock of corn that comes in its season. So verses 17 through 26 from the slide here. The discourse is the fate of the righteous. And then the last verse is a concluding address. He says, behold, look, we have searched this out. And the we here appears to be Eliphaz and all the other wisdom teachers. So we've searched this out. Here it is. And he's talking about that vision that he saw in the night, but this is not referring to that. This is searching this out, human inquiry, and this is it. And the only thing that you can do, as I sum up this speech, Job, is take it to heart. Hear it and know it for your good. For your good. All right, so we've looked at the prologue and we've looked at Eliphaz's first speech as we're into the cycle of the speeches in 4:1 through 5:27, and that's the end of this fourth lecture as we're thinking about the book of Job as we're going through it.